He was one of the richest men in the world, a titan of industry whose name was etched onto skyscrapers and whose decisions could shift global markets. Alistair Croft could acquire any company, bend any politician to his will, and purchase any object of desire that caught his eye. But all his immense wealth, all his terrifying power, could not fix his daughter. It could not buy back her voice, nor purchase a single genuine smile for her face. After firing 7 nannies, 4 maids, and a legion of the world's most expensive specialists, he had come to believe his 6-year-old daughter Lily was a beautiful porcelain doll destined to remain on a shelf, seen but never truly present. The diagnosis was profound childhood apathy syndrome, a clinical, sterile term for a grief so deep it had swallowed a child whole. Then a woman with quiet hands and eyes that held a history of their own sorrow showed up for an interview. Her name was Ilara. She was not a specialist, had no advanced degrees, and carried with her the faint, lingering scent of loss that Alistair knew all too well. He hired her out of sheer exhaustion, a final futile gesture before surrendering completely. He never expected that this humble housekeeper, with a past more painful than he could imagine, would be the one to uncover a secret so monstrous it would not only shatter his world, but also, in the breaking, finally put it back together. He certainly never expected the discovery she would make, a discovery that would break him completely before offering the slimmest, most terrifying sliver of redemption. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. The Croft mansion was less a home and more a mausoleum. Perched on a cliff overlooking a tempestuous sea, its vast glass walls and minimalist design seemed engineered to amplify silence, to make loneliness a tangible architectural feature. Marble floors echoed with the ghosts of footsteps that were never taken, and the air, filtered and climate-controlled, held no scent of life, no baking bread, no blooming flowers, no hint of human warmth. It was a monument to loss, meticulously maintained. Alistair walked its halls like a warden, his shoulders perpetually tight, his jaw set against the grief that had become the permanent architecture of his face. He had lost his wife, Isabella, 2 years ago in a car accident that felt less like a tragedy and more like a cosmic theft. But in many ways, he felt he had lost Lily long before that. The light in her had begun to dim in the months leading up to the accident, and Isabella's death had extinguished it completely. Now she was a silent passenger in her own life, her days spent sitting in a large armchair in the conservatory, her gaze fixed on something beyond the manicured gardens, beyond the sea itself. Her only companion was a small, worn wooden horse, its paint rubbed away by the constant, anxious grip of her small fingers. Ilara's arrival was so quiet it was almost imperceptible. She did not fill the silence. She simply became a part of it. Mrs. Gable, the stern, long-suffering head of staff, gave her the tour with an air of weary resignation, pointing out the cleaning protocols for the Italian marble, the precise humidity levels for the art collection, and the long list of Lily's failed caregivers. "She doesn't speak, she doesn't react, she barely eats," Mrs. Gable stated, her voice flat. "Your duties are to keep her room tidy, ensure her meals are placed before her, and not to disturb her. Mr. Croft is very particular about that. No sudden movements, no loud noises. Treat her as you would a priceless, fragile vase." Ilara nodded, her expression unreadable. She had been given the same warnings about fragile things before. She knew that sometimes the most fragile things were also the strongest, if only you knew how to hold them. Her first day was a study in observation. She cleaned Lily's room with slow, deliberate movements. The room was as sterile as a hospital ward, all creams and whites, with toys that were perfectly arranged and clearly untouched. The only object that showed any sign of love or use was the little wooden horse resting on the bedside table, where Lily had left it before being guided to the conservatory. Elara ran a dust cloth over the smooth, perfect surfaces, her mind a quiet catalogue of details. The way the sunlight hit the floor, the faint scent of lavender from the prescribed linen spray, the absolute unnerving stillness of the air. Later, she stood at the edge of the conservatory, watching the little girl in the armchair. Lily was a portrait of stillness, her dark hair a stark contrast against her pale skin, her eyes wide and vacant. Elara felt a familiar ache in her chest, a phantom limb of sorrow for a loss of her own that was still so raw it felt like an open wound. She didn't try to engage. She didn't say hello. She simply took a seat in a far corner, ostensibly to polish the silver frames on a side table, and began to hum. It was a soft, absent-minded tune, a half-forgotten lullaby that surfaced from the deep well of her memory without conscious thought. She hummed it under her breath, a private, sorrowful melody that filled the space between the sterile ticking of the grandfather clock and the distant crash of waves. She wasn't humming for Lily. She was humming for herself, for the ghost of another little girl who had once fallen asleep to that very song. She expected no reaction and received none. Lily remained motionless, her gaze fixed on the horizon. But Elara, a quiet observer by nature and by necessity, saw something else. It was almost nothing, a flicker of movement so small that anyone else would have dismissed it as a trick of the light. For a single fleeting second, as the melody crested on a particularly gentle note, Lily's fingers, which were resting limply in her lap, tightened. It was a minute contraction of muscle, a brief clenching that lasted no longer than a heartbeat before her hand went slack again. But it had happened. It was a response. Elara's breath caught in her throat. Mrs. Gable had said Lily didn't react. The doctors had said she was lost in a world of her own, unreachable. But that tiny infinitesimal movement was not random. It was a signal, a flicker of light from a deeply submerged lighthouse. And in that instant, Elara knew with a certainty that resonated in the hollow space in her own heart that the official story was wrong. Everyone was looking at the vase, but she was the only one who had just seen a crack, not of damage, but of something trying to break out from within. The cold, sterile mansion suddenly felt charged with a secret, and Elara knew her job here was no longer just about cleaning. It was about listening to a silence that, she now suspected, was screaming to be heard. Elara did not report what she had seen. To speak of it would be to invite skepticism, dismissal, perhaps even the loss of a job she desperately needed. More importantly, it would subject Lily to another round of prodding and observation from people who saw a patient, not a person. So she kept the secret, holding it close like a fragile ember she needed to protect from the wind. Her days fell into a new rhythm, one defined not by the cleaning schedule laid out by Mrs. Gable, but by a series of quiet, gentle experiments. Her work became a cover for her true purpose, to find that flicker of light again, to coax it, to understand it. She learned that the world believed Lily to be blind to its offerings and deaf to its calls. But Elara's intuition, honed by the sharp edges of her own grief, told her otherwise. It told her that Lily wasn't deaf. She was simply listening for a different frequency. Her primary laboratory was the conservatory, that glass box of curated nature where Lily spent most of her waking hours. Instead of staying in the corner, Elara began to bring her work closer. She would polish the brass fittings on the large telescope near Lily's chair, her movements slow and rhythmic, and she would hum, always the same lullaby. She watched not Lily's face, which remained a placid, heartbreakingly blank canvas, but her hands. The reaction came again, that same minute tightening of her fingers, always on the same two notes of the melody. It was consistent. It was real. Emboldened, Elara expanded her repertoire of stimuli. She began to draw. She had always found solace in sketching, a way to process a world that was often too loud and too painful. She brought a small, leather-bound sketchbook and a stick of charcoal with her. Sitting on the floor a respectful distance from Lily, she would draw the things she saw outside the glass walls. A ship on the horizon, the curve of a breaking wave, a seabird coasting on the wind. She didn't speak the words, but she drew their shapes, giving them form in bold, simple lines. One afternoon, while sketching a gnarled oak tree that stood defiantly against the coastal winds, she left the sketchbook and the charcoal on a low table, well within Lily's reach, but not intrusively so. She then moved to the other side of the room to dust the bookshelves, her back to the child, though her senses were on high alert. The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of her cloth against the wood and the distant cry of gulls. When she turned back, her heart gave a painful lurch. The sketchbook was untouched. Lily hadn't moved. A wave of disappointment, sharp and cold, washed over her. She had been foolish, projecting her own desperate hope onto a child lost to the world. She gathered her cleaning supplies, her movements heavier than before. As she reached for the sketchbook, intending to pack it away, she stopped. Her eyes narrowed. Something was different. A smudge. A faint gray mark near the bottom of the page, a place that had been pristine white just moments before. It was nothing, a stray bit of dust, a flaw in the paper. But then she looked at Lily's hand, the one resting on the arm of the chair. On the very tip of her index finger was a tiny, almost invisible smear of charcoal. Ilara's breath hitched. She looked back at the page, at her drawing of the bird in the sky. And then she saw it. It wasn't just a smudge. It was a line, a wavering, faint, and uncertain line, but a line nonetheless. It started near the bird she had drawn and traveled a short, shaky distance toward the edge of the page in the direction of the window. It was a gesture, a direction, a thought made manifest. The bird is out there. It was the quietest, most profound scream Ilara had ever heard. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, hot and sudden. This wasn't a blank canvas. This was a soul trapped behind glass, and she had just found a way to pass a note through. From Alistair's perspective, Ilara was simply efficient. He'd review the security footage from his office, a cold habit he'd developed to monitor the revolving door of staff. He saw her cleaning, moving through the house like a phantom. He saw her sitting in the conservatory, a silent sentinel. At first he was merely satisfied by her unobtrusiveness. The others had tried too hard. They had brought brightly colored toys that lay ignored, played loud, cheerful music that only amplified the silence, and spoken to Lily in high-pitched, patronizing tones that grated on his nerves. They had tried to force a reaction to pry open the closed door of his daughter's mind. Ilara did none of that. She simply existed, a calming presence in a house that vibrated with tension. His grief was a raw, exposed nerve, and her quietude was a balm, even if he wouldn't admit it. He had given up on hope for Lily. Now he only wished for peace. And Ilara, for reasons he couldn't fathom, brought a measure of it. He saw her sketching, but dismissed it as a way to pass the tedious hours. He didn't see the details. From the grainy monitor in his sterile office, he couldn't see the faint line on the page or the charcoal dust on his daughter's finger. He saw only the illusion of the stasis he had come to accept, unaware that in the quiet conservatory below, a silent revolution had just begun. Ilara carefully tore the page from her sketchbook, folded it, and tucked it into her pocket. It was proof. It was a secret. It was the beginning of everything. The discovery of the charcoal line was a key turning a lock deep inside Ilara. The fragile ember of suspicion she'd been nursing now glowed with a steady, determined heat. She knew she was on the right path, a path no one else had even thought to look for. The challenge now was to widen it, to make it solid enough for a little girl to walk on. She began to treat the sketchbook as a bridge. Every day, in the quiet hours of the afternoon, she would sit with Lily in the conservatory and draw. She drew the sun, giving it a smiling face. She drew a boat, adding little stick figures waving from the deck. She drew a cat chasing a ball of yarn. She would leave each drawing along with the charcoal on the low table. She never pushed, never prompted. She would simply create a world on the page and leave the door open. For days, nothing happened. Lily remained still, her gaze distant. The charcoal on her finger had been a fluke, Elora started to fear, a moment of accidental grace that would not be repeated. The doubt was a cold poison seeping into the warmth of her initial discovery, but her own past had taught her the brutal arithmetic of patience. Healing was not a straight line. It was a slow, painful spiral, and you had to be willing to walk the same ground 100 times before you moved an inch forward. So, she persisted. She drew a simple house with a plume of smoke curling from its chimney. She drew a tall, slender flower with 5 distinct petals, and she hummed. The lullaby had become their unspoken anthem, the soundtrack to their silent conversations. One rainy Tuesday, the world outside the conservatory was a wash of gray. The sea was churning, and rain lashed against the immense glass panes. The sound filled the room, a rhythmic, melancholic drumming. Elora felt the sadness of the day acutely. It reminded her of other rainy days, of a small hand that used to fit so perfectly in hers. To combat the gloom, she decided to draw something bright. She drew a large, smiling sun, its rays filling the entire page. She added a rainbow arcing over it, sketching the bands and imagining the colors. As she worked, she began to hum the lullaby, her voice a little louder than usual, a soft counterpoint to the storm outside. She reached the 2 notes, the ones that had first elicited a response from Lily. This time, however, something different happened. It wasn't just the clenching of Lily's fingers. From the small, still form in the armchair came a sound. It was quiet, tentative, a little breathless, like the first note from a flute that hadn't been played in years. It was a hum, a single questioning note that tried to match her own. Elora froze, her hand hovering over the paper. The charcoal stick was suddenly heavy, an anchor in a world that had just been set adrift. She slowly, carefully lifted her head. Lily's face, for the first time since Elora had arrived, was turned toward her. Her eyes, those deep, dark pools that were always fixed on some distant, invisible point, were focused directly on Elora. They were not vacant. They were filled with an ancient, weary curiosity. She held her breath, a wild, impossible hope, beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had to do something, say something. But what? Any sudden move, any exclamation of joy could shatter this impossibly fragile moment. So she did the only thing she could think of. She smiled, a small, gentle smile that she hoped conveyed all the wonder and welcome she was feeling. And she hummed the note again softly. Lily watched her, her head tilted slightly. Then her lips parted, and she repeated the sound, a little stronger this time. It was a call and response, a dialogue. A torrent of emotion threatened to overwhelm Elora. She saw not the diagnosed apathetic child, but a prisoner tapping on the wall of her cell, and she had finally heard it. Tears welled, blurring the image of the little girl before her. She blinked them back fiercely, refusing to let them fall. This moment wasn't about her grief. It was about Lily's awakening. As she held Lily's gaze, she saw the child's right hand, which had been resting on the worn wooden horse, lift from her lap. It rose slowly, unsteadily, a pale flag of truce. It didn't reach far, extending only a few inches in Elora's direction before it seemed to lose its strength and fall back into her lap. But it was a gesture of monumental significance. It was an attempt to connect. Upstairs, in his steel and glass office, Alistair Croft was losing a battle against a hostile takeover bid from a German conglomerate. He was barking orders into his phone, his voice sharp with command. when a flicker of movement on one of the smaller security monitors caught his eye. It was the feed from the conservatory. He usually kept it muted, a silent, moving portrait of his static daughter. But the movement had been too distinct to ignore. He saw Lily's head turned away from the window, facing the new housekeeper. Annoyance flared. He had given strict instructions. Don't disturb her. He ended his call abruptly and unmuted the audio feed for the conservatory, his finger hovering over the intercom button, ready to issue a sharp reprimand. But the sound that filled his office was not the babble of a nanny trying to force interaction. It was a soft, melodic humming, and then he heard it. A second hum, faint and reedy, answering the first. Alistair went completely still. His mind refused to process the information his ears were delivering. He leaned closer to the monitor, his eyes wide. He saw Ilara smile. He saw his daughter, his beautiful, broken, silent daughter, lift her hand. It was a gesture he hadn't seen in 2 years, not since before Isabella. He felt the air leave his lungs, as if by a physical blow. The carefully constructed walls he had built around his heart, the walls of cynicism and resignation, began to crumble. A feeling he had long since buried, a dangerous and painful emotion, clawed its way to the surface. Hope. It was terrifying. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, wanting to fly but knowing the fall would destroy him. He didn't rush down. He didn't call. He just sat there in his throne of power, utterly powerless, watching a quiet woman and a humming child rewrite the entire story of his life. The hostile takeover, the billions of dollars hanging in the balance, all of it evaporated into insignificance. The only thing that mattered was the impossible, terrifying, beautiful thing happening on that small screen. The fragile moment in the conservatory stretched into a tense and uncertain silence in the days that followed. Alistair did not mention what he had seen. He was a man accustomed to dealing with concrete data, with profit and loss statements, with predictable outcomes. What he had witnessed on the monitor felt like a hallucination, a trick of light and sound, born from his own desperate longing. To acknowledge it, to give it voice, would be to risk it dissolving into nothing, but he couldn't ignore it. The image of Lily's hand reaching out was burned into his mind. He found himself watching the security feeds, not with passive resignation, but with a sharp, painful attentiveness. He saw Ilara and Lily in their silent communion. He saw the sketchbook passed between them like a diplomatic pouch. And he saw his daughter, who hadn't willingly turned her head in years, follow Ilara with her eyes as she moved about the room. The internal conflict was tearing him apart. Years of advice from the world's leading specialists, chief among them Dr. Martin Albright, a trusted family friend, and Lily's primary physician, had conditioned him to believe that Lily's condition was permanent and profound. They had warned him against false hope and unorthodox methods. Dr. Albright had been particularly firm, insisting that Lily needed a placid, stimulation-free environment to avoid agitating her fragile psyche. Ilara's gentle humming and her charcoal drawings were a direct violation of that doctrine. Yet, the evidence of his own eyes was undeniable. His daughter was changing. He decided he had to act. He couldn't let it continue without understanding, without control. He intercepted Ilara one evening as she was leaving for the day, cornering her in the vast, echoing entrance hall. His voice was rougher than he intended, laced with a desperation that bordered on accusation. "What are you doing with my daughter?" Ilara was not intimidated. She met his gaze directly, her own eyes calm and clear. "I'm getting to know her," she said simply. "The humming, the drawings." "I saw you," he pressed, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "The doctors, they all said—" "With all due respect, Mr. Croft," Ilara interrupted, her voice soft but firm, "the doctors see a diagnosis. I see a little girl who is lonely." She hesitated, then reached into the pocket of her simple cardigan and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was the drawing of the bird, the one with the faint shaky line extending from it. "She drew this," Elara said, holding it out to him. "This was her telling me the bird was outside. She's in there, Mr. Croft. She just needs someone to listen to the silence." Alistair stared at the paper. The line was so faint, so insignificant. It could be anything, a stray mark, an accident. His mind, trained to be analytical and ruthless, screamed at him to dismiss it. This woman was a housekeeper, not a doctor. She was projecting, seeing patterns where none existed. "This is nothing," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "You're giving me false hope. I forbid you from continuing with this fantasy. Stick to your duties, the ones you were hired for. Do not engage with her. Is that clear?" The light in Elara's eyes dimmed, but she did not argue. She simply nodded, took the drawing back, and left him standing alone in the cavernous hall. The house reverted to its former state. The humming stopped. The sketchbook disappeared. Elara became a ghost again, cleaning silently, her presence once more unobtrusive. And Lily retreated. The flicker of life that had begun to spark in her eyes vanished, replaced by the old, familiar vacancy. She stopped turning her head. She sat in her chair, a perfect still statue, her hands once again clenched tightly around her wooden horse. The change was stark and immediate, and it was a torment for Alistair. He had gotten what he asked for, a return to the prescribed sterile routine, and it felt like a death. A few days later, driven by a grief so profound it felt like he was drowning, Alistair found himself in Lily's room in the middle of the night. He couldn't sleep. He sat on the edge of her bed watching the slow, even rise and fall of her chest. His gaze fell upon a wastebasket in the corner. On top of a few discarded tissues was Elara's sketchbook. Mrs. Gable must have found it and thrown it out. On impulse, Alistair retrieved it. He sat there in the dim light, flipping through the pages. The simple, heartfelt drawings of suns, boats, and animals felt like a punch to the gut. They were messages of hope, of connection, all of which he had ordered to cease. The last page contained a clumsy, unfinished drawing of a bird. Without thinking, he picked up a pencil from the nightstand. His own hand felt foreign and clumsy as he tried to replicate the drawing Elara had shown him. He sketched a crude bird in the corner of a blank page. He waited, his heart pounding. Nothing. Of course, nothing. Lily was asleep. He was a fool. Defeated, he placed the sketchbook on the nightstand and turned to leave. A small sound stopped him cold. A soft, questioning hum. He spun around. Lily's eyes were open in the darkness. They weren't looking at him. They were fixed on the sketchbook, on his clumsy drawing of a bird. And then she hummed again the same note she had made for Elara. It was a question. It was a plea. It was undeniable proof. In that moment, the wall of denial Alistair had so carefully constructed was obliterated. Tears streamed down his face, hot and unchecked. He had been wrong. So terrifyingly, devastatingly wrong. The next morning he found Elara in the kitchen before the rest of the staff had arrived. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed, but his voice was clear, stripped of all its usual arrogance and authority. It was the voice of a man surrendering. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling inadequate. "I was wrong. Please, help me, help my daughter." The alliance was formed, not with a handshake, but with a shared look of understanding, a quiet pact made in the pre-dawn gloom to pull a little girl back from the brink. With Alistair's formidable resources now at her disposal, Elara's quiet investigation transformed into a full-scale operation. The alliance between the billionaire and the housekeeper was an unlikely one, a union of power and intuition. Alistair cleared his schedule, delegating multi-million-dollar decisions to his subordinates with a dismissive wave of his hand. His sole focus, for the first time in a long time, was his daughter. He converted a rarely used library into their headquarters, its mahogany table quickly buried under stacks of medical files, psychological assessments, and developmental reports, a paper trail documenting 2 years of Lily's descent into silence. Alistair attacked the problem as he would a corporate merger, looking for data points and logical fallacies. He built spreadsheets, cross-referencing medication schedules with behavioral notes. Ilara, meanwhile, approached the files differently. She looked for the human story within the clinical jargon. She read the nurses' notes not for what they said, but for what they didn't. She looked for the spaces between the lines. While Alistair watched old home videos on a large monitor, his face a mask of pain, as he saw a laughing, vibrant toddler who bore no resemblance to the silent child in the conservatory, Ilara sat with the physical files, the texture of the paper, and the scent of old ink grounding her. It was Ilara who first noticed the pattern. "Dr. Albright," she said one afternoon, her finger tracing a line in a thick binder. Every time his dosage of the trial medication was increased, the nurse's notes mentioned Lily becoming more lethargic, more withdrawn. He documents it as a symptomatic regression and uses it as justification for the next increase. But what if it's not the symptom? What if it's the cause? Alistair stopped the video, the image of a 2-year-old Lily chasing butterflies freezing on the screen. He came to stand behind her, looking at the charts she had laid out. She was right. There was a direct correlation. A cold knot of dread began to form in his stomach. Martin Albright had been his wife's friend before he was his. He had been a pillar of support after her death, the one constant reassuring voice in the chaos of grief. To doubt him felt like a betrayal. "Martin is the best in his field," Alistair said, the words sounding hollow even to himself. He couldn't finish the sentence. The search intensified. Alistair wanted concrete proof, something more than a correlation. He told Ilara that his wife, Isabella, had been a meticulous record keeper. Her office on the 3rd floor had been sealed since her death. He hadn't been able to bring himself to enter it. "Perhaps there's something in there," he said, his voice strained. He gave Ilara the key. The room was like a time capsule, dust motes dancing in the single beam of light from the window. Everything was exactly as Isabella had left it. A coffee cup sat on the desk. A book was open to a dog-eared page. The scent of her perfume, faint and floral, still clung to the air. Ilara felt like an intruder, a profaner of sacred ground. She moved with reverence, her search gentle and respectful. She looked through desk drawers, filing cabinets, and bookshelves. She found investment portfolios, charity gala plans, and correspondence, but nothing related to Lily's medical care. Disappointed, she was about to leave when something caught her eye. A small, decorative wooden box on the mantelpiece, inlaid with mother of pearl. It looked purely ornamental. But on closer inspection, Ilara saw a false bottom. Her fingers trembled slightly as she worked it open. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a small leather-bound journal. It was Isabella's private diary. Ilara knew she was crossing a line, but a powerful instinct told her the answers were here. She sat in Isabella's chair and began to read. The early entries were filled with love and joy, notes about Lily's first words, her funny antics, the overwhelming love she felt for her daughter and husband. But as the pages turned, the tone began to shift. A thread of anxiety appeared. Isabella wrote about Lily becoming quieter, less engaged. Then came the first mention of Dr. Albright's new treatment plan. October 14th. Martin started Lily on the new medication today. He calls it a breakthrough in treating childhood trauma. He's so confident, but I don't know. It seems so strong for such a little girl. The entries grew more worried. November 5th. Lily seems so tired all the time. She didn't want to play in the garden today. She just sat on the steps. Martin says this is a normal part of the adjustment period, that her mind is recalibrating. I don't like this. It doesn't feel right. December 1st, we had another argument. I told Martin I wanted to wean Lily off the drug. He was so forceful, almost angry. He said I was letting my emotions cloud my judgment, that I was jeopardizing her recovery. Alistair agrees with him. I feel like I'm going crazy. Then Elora found the final entry. It was dated the day before Isabella's fatal accident. The handwriting was rushed, almost frantic. January 22nd. He's not listening. I know something is wrong. I went against his wishes and had a private lab run a full toxicology screen on Lily's blood. I told Martin I was taking her for an allergy test. The results came back this morning. I don't even understand them, but the lab technician sounded alarmed. He said he's never seen levels like this. The medicine is poisoning her. It has to be. I'm going to get a second opinion tomorrow from Dr. Evans at the city hospital. I have the blood test results from the independent lab in my bag. I'll confront Martin afterward. He has to listen to me now. He has to. Elora's blood ran cold. She closed the journal, her heart hammering against her ribs. Isabella hadn't died in a tragic accident. She had been on her way to expose the truth. The lab results, the crucial piece of evidence, had been in her bag. A bag that the police report had stated was never recovered from the scene of the fiery crash. Elara walked out of the office and down to the library, the journal held tightly in her hand. She found Alistair staring at the frozen image of his laughing wife on the monitor. She didn't have to say a word. He saw the look on her face, saw the journal in her hand, and he knew. She placed the open journal on the table in front of him. As he read the final desperate entry from his dead wife, a terrible guttural sound of pure agony was torn from his throat. The foundation of his world had just turned to dust. The discovery of Isabella's journal shattered Alistair's grief and reforged it into a cold, diamond-hard rage. The man he had trusted, the friend who had held him up at his wife's funeral, was a monster. The betrayal was so profound, so absolute, it eclipsed everything else. All the pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Dr. Albright hadn't been treating Lily, he had been using her. The vague diagnosis, the escalating dosages, the dismissal of Isabella's concerns, it was all part of a monstrous, calculated deception. The guilt that crashed over Alistair was a physical force, bending him double over the mahogany table. He had sided with Albright. He had dismissed his own wife's fears as the over-anxious worrying of a mother. He had let this happen. "I'll destroy him," he whispered, his voice a raw rasp. It wasn't a threat. It was a vow. He was no longer a grieving husband. He was an instrument of vengeance. He got on the phone, his voice now devoid of any emotion, but icy command. He mobilized the most ruthless division of his corporation, his legal and corporate intelligence teams. These were the sharks he usually unleashed on business rivals, men and women who could find a single damning secret in a mountain of data. Their new target was Dr. Martin Albright. While Alistair's corporate machine whirred into motion, Elara focused on Lily. Knowing the truth about the medication changed everything. With Alistair's tearful permission, she immediately stopped administering the morning and evening doses of the clear, syrupy liquid. She replaced it with a vitamin-laced fruit juice, making sure to dispose of the actual medication carefully. They had to maintain the illusion that nothing had changed to keep Albright from becoming suspicious while Alistair gathered his ammunition. The effect of ceasing the medication was not immediate, but within a week Elara began to notice subtle shifts. There was a new clarity in Lily's eyes. Her periods of sleep became less profound, less like a coma, and more like actual rest. She was more aware of her surroundings, her head turning at the sound of a door opening or a bird singing outside the window. They were small, incremental changes, but to Elara and Alistair, they were seismic events. The report from Alistair's intelligence team came back within 48 hours, and it was more damning than they could have imagined. Dr. Albright was financially ruined. A series of disastrous investments and a spiraling gambling addiction had left him millions of dollars in debt to dangerous people. His prestige and his family name were the only things keeping his creditors at bay. But the real bombshell was his connection to a small, boutique pharmaceutical research firm. Albright was the majority shareholder and the lead researcher. Their flagship product was an experimental drug called Neurolax, designed to treat severe psychological trauma. The drug was stalled in the early phases of clinical trials, plagued by reports of severe neurological side effects in test subjects, including lethargy, dissociation, and catatonia. Neurolax was the exact drug he had been prescribing to Lily, off-label and in dangerously high doses. He hadn't been treating her, he had been using her as his own private, long-term, unmonitored human trial. A successful case study, especially one involving the daughter of a prominent billionaire, would allow him to bypass regulations, secure a massive buyout from a major pharmaceutical company, and solve all his financial woes. Lily's profound childhood apathy syndrome wasn't a pre-existing condition. It was a side effect he had manufactured and then cruelly used as evidence that his treatment was necessary. The final piece of the puzzle was Isabella's accident. Alistair's team, working with a retired NTSB investigator, re-examined the police reports and photographs from the crash. They discovered inconsistencies in the burn patterns on the brake lines, suggesting the use of a chemical accelerant. It wasn't brake failure, it was deliberate sabotage. Isabella was silenced because she was hours away from exposing his entire fraudulent, murderous enterprise. The motive was clear, the means were evident, and the perpetrator was unmistakable. Alistair arranged the meeting. He didn't want to call the police yet. That would come later. First, he needed to see the man's face. He summoned Dr. Albright to the mansion under the pretense of discussing a new philanthropic grant for his research. Albright arrived, exuding his usual air of calm authority and compassionate wisdom. He was dressed impeccably, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, a warm, professional smile on his face. He offered Alistair his condolences for still having to deal with such a difficult situation. Alistair led him into the library, the same room where he and Alara had uncovered the truth. The medical files were gone, replaced by a single object in the center of the vast table. Isabella's journal, opened to the final entry. Albright's smile faltered as he saw it. "What is this?" he asked, his voice losing some of its warmth. "I found my wife's diary," Alistair said, his own voice unnervingly calm. "It makes for very interesting reading." He watched as Albright's eyes scanned the page. He saw the flicker of recognition, the dawning of panic, the blood draining from the doctor's face. This is the rambling of a grieving, unstable woman," Albright stammered, trying to regain his composure. Isabella was not herself at the end. She was paranoid. "Was she paranoid about your gambling debts?" Alistair asked, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Was she paranoid about your patent on Neurolax? Was she paranoid about the fact that you were using my daughter as a lab rat, poisoning her to build a case study for a drug you knew was dangerous?" With each question, Alistair took a step closer. The doctor's facade of professionalism crumbled, replaced by raw, naked fear. He backed away, shaking his head, sputtering denials. He turned to flee, but the library doors swung open, and two of Alistair's security guards blocked the exit. The mask was off. The monster was revealed. The central truth, in all its horror, was finally out in the open, and the sterile quiet of the mansion was filled with the ugliness of its unveiling. Dr. Albright, cornered and exposed, did not collapse. He fought back with the desperation of a trapped animal, using the only weapons he had left, his reputation and his cunning. Before Alistair could consolidate his evidence and present an ironclad case to the authorities, Albright launched a preemptive strike. He knew he couldn't win a direct fight against Alistair's resources, so he chose a different battlefield. Public opinion and the bureaucracy of child welfare. He vanished from public view, but his lawyers released a statement to the press. It was a masterpiece of manipulative fiction. Dr. Albright, the statement claimed, had been forced to step away from Lillycroft's care due to the increasingly erratic and dangerous behavior of her father. It painted Alistair as a man unhinged by grief who had fallen under the spell of an unqualified and manipulative new housekeeper. The statement expressed grave concern for Lily's safety, alleging that she was being subjected to bizarre, pseudoscientific rituals and was being denied her essential, life-stabilizing medication by a woman with no medical training. The story was explosive. "Grieving billionaire's bizarre home life," screamed the tabloid headlines. News vans camped outside the gates of the Croft estate. Alara's face was splashed across the internet, her simple, quiet life twisted into a narrative of a scheming charlatan preying on a vulnerable family. But the most venomous part of Albright's attack was yet to come. He anonymously filed a detailed, compelling complaint with Child Protective Services. He used his intimate knowledge of the family's history, twisting every detail to support his narrative of neglect and abuse. He described Alara's humming and drawing as psychological manipulation, and the cessation of the medication as life-threatening medical negligence. The retaliation was swift and brutal. 2 days later, a black sedan pulled up the long driveway. A social worker, a woman with tired eyes and a grim expression, and 2 uniformed police officers stood at the front door. They presented Alistair with an emergency court order. It granted temporary custody of Lily to the state, pending a full investigation into the allegations of endangerment. And it included a restraining order against one Ilara Vance, barring her from coming within 500 feet of the child. The scene in the foyer was one of cold, bureaucratic horror. Ilara stood pale and trembling as the social worker explained the legal jargon. Alistair argued, his voice shaking with rage, but the court order was immutable. They were there to take Lily. When they went to the conservatory, Lily was sitting with Ilara, the 2 of them looking at a picture book. For the first time, Lily had pointed to a picture of a yellow duck and whispered a sound, "Duh." It was the first syllable she had uttered in 2 years. The moment of triumph was shattered by the arrival of the strangers. Lily, seeing the unfamiliar faces and sensing the tension, shrank back, her progress immediately erased by fear. She clung to Alara's leg, her knuckles white. The social worker tried to approach, her voice gentle, but Lily let out a thin, terrified wail and buried her face in Alara's dress. The sight of his daughter's terror broke something in Alistair, but he was powerless. When a police officer gently but firmly took Ilara by the arm to escort her from the room, Lily's wail turned into a heart-wrenching shriek of pure panic. She was separated from Ilara, her only lifeline, her anchor in a confusing world. Ilara was led out of the house, her own tears blurring the sight of the grand foyer. The last thing she heard was Lily screaming. The sound was a physical blade in her heart. Alistair was left alone in the house with the social worker, who was trying in vain to calm his hysterical daughter. Lily was taken to a neutral, state-approved care facility. Separated from Ilara, from the familiar if sterile environment of her home, and back under the care of doctors who immediately reinstated Albright's medication at the recommendation of the court, she regressed completely. The small, flickering light that Ilara had so patiently nurtured was extinguished. She fell back into a silence more profound and desolate than before, refusing to eat, refusing to open her eyes. Albright's retaliation was a strategic masterstroke. He had not only discredited his accusers, but had also successfully removed the one person who could help Lily, and had taken away the living proof of his crimes, Lily's recovery, by plunging her back into the darkness. Alistair was left in his silent, empty mansion, a king in a hollow castle, having lost the only battle that ever truly mattered. The loss of Lily galvanized Alistair. transforming his rage into a focused, terrifyingly potent weapon. The initial shock and despair gave way to an absolute resolve. He would not be beaten by this man. He would not lose his daughter again. He assembled his legal team, not just corporate lawyers, but the most formidable criminal and family law attorneys in the country. The war room was no longer the library. It was the main boardroom of Croft Industries downtown, a place of immense power, now dedicated to a single purpose. While the lawyers filed emergency appeals and battled the media storm, Alistair set his private investigators on a new urgent task. Find the independent lab and the technician mentioned in Isabella's journal. It was a long shot. The entry was over 2 years old, but it was their only hope for concrete, irrefutable evidence that predated Ilara's arrival and could blow Albright's narrative out of the water. The investigators worked around the clock. They discovered that the lab, Biostat Analytics, had abruptly closed down shortly after Isabella's death. The owner had retired and moved to Costa Rica. It seemed like a dead end. But one of the junior investigators, a tenacious young man, kept digging. He tracked down a list of former employees. One of them, a lab technician named Ben Carter, was living in a quiet suburb 100 miles away, working as a high school chemistry teacher. Two of Alistair's best investigators paid Mr. Carter a visit. At first he was terrified. He denied everything, claiming he didn't remember the tests or Isabella Croft. But the investigators were persistent and persuasive. They assured him of Alistair's full protection. Finally, sitting at his small kitchen table, the retired technician confessed. He remembered Isabella vividly. He said she was a kind, worried mother who had paid cash for an anonymous toxicology screen. The results had been so alarming, so off the charts with an unidentifiable synthetic compound, that he had been deeply troubled. He had tried to call her the day after she picked up the results to urge her to see a specialist, but her phone went straight to voicemail. When he heard the news of her death on the radio the next day, a cold fear settled in him. A few weeks later, men in suits had visited the lab, buying out the owner with a generous offer and making it clear that all records were to be destroyed. Ben, fearing for his family's safety, had kept his mouth shut. But he hadn't destroyed everything. Driven by a guilty conscience, he had made a personal copy of the toxicology report and had hidden it away. He retrieved a dusty accordion file from his attic. Inside was the proof. A detailed chemical breakdown of Lily's blood, showing toxic, near-lethal levels of the primary compound in Neurolax. Meanwhile, Ilara, sequestered in a luxury hotel suite paid for by Alistair, was fighting her own battle against despair. The silence, the separation from Lily, was a constant ache. She spent her days pacing, replaying every moment, searching her memory for anything she might have missed. And then something surfaced. A fleeting image from one of her first days of cleaning. It was a photograph on a side table in the main gallery, a wide shot from a hospital charity gala a few months before Isabella's death. She had been dusting the frame. In the background of the photo, behind Alistair and Isabella, who were the main subjects, she had noticed Dr. Albright. He was in a hushed, intense conversation with another man. At the time, she had paid it no mind. But now she remembered the other man's face and a detail on his uniform, the logo of Prestige Auto, the high-end garage that serviced all the Croft family vehicles. Why would the eminent Dr. Albright be in a deep private conversation with a mechanic at a black-tie gala? She immediately called Alistair's head of security. The final piece clicked into place. The investigators located the mechanic, a man named Rico. Faced with the photograph, financial records showing a large, unexplained cash deposit into his account the day after the gala, and the new forensic analysis of the brake lines, Rico's bravado crumbled. Under the promise of a plea deal and witness protection, he confessed everything. Dr. Albright had approached him at the gala, learning he worked on the Croft cars. He had exploited Rico's own gambling debts, offering him a sum of money that would change his life in exchange for one simple, untraceable act: tampering with the brake fluid reservoir cap on Isabella Croft's car, ensuring a slow leak that would lead to catastrophic failure at high speed. They had it all: the motive, the medical evidence, the murder weapon, and the confession. Alistair's lawyers immediately contacted the district attorney's office. This would not be a media battle anymore. This was now a murder investigation. Alistair didn't want a quiet meeting this time. He wanted a formal confrontation, a stage for Albright's complete and utter destruction. He arranged for a voluntary deposition with the DA, inviting Dr. Albright and his legal team, letting them walk straight into the perfectly laid trap. The deposition room was cold and sterile, a stark contrast to the opulent warmth of the Croft Mansion's library. Dr. Martin Albright sat at one side of the long, polished table, flanked by two expensive-looking lawyers. He appeared confident, even arrogant. He believed this was a formality, a chance for his legal team to swat away the desperate, unsubstantiated claims of a deranged billionaire. He saw this as the final act in his victory, the moment he would cement his narrative and permanently secure his safety. Alistair sat opposite him, his face an unreadable mask of stone. Hilara was not present, but her essence filled the room for Alistair. Her quiet strength, her unwavering belief in Lily, was the fuel for his cold fury. The assistant district attorney, a sharp woman named Cardenas, began the proceedings. Albright's lawyers were dismissive, objecting to the line of questioning, citing the ongoing family court case as evidence of Alistair's instability. They painted a picture of a grieving father lashing out, creating a vast conspiracy theory to cope with his pain. Dr. Albright played his part perfectly, his face a mask of sorrowful concern. "All I have ever wanted was what's best for Lily," he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "It's a tragedy to see Alistair fall this far." Ada Cardenas let him finish. Then she nodded to the bailiff at the door. "Let's start with the medicine," she said calmly. The door opened, and Ben Carter, the retired lab technician, walked in. He looked nervous, but his eyes were steady. He took a seat at the table. Albright stared at him, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He didn't recognize the man. Cardenas presented the toxicology report. "Mr. Carter, can you identify this document?" Ben Carter explained in a clear, precise voice the nature of the test he had run for Isabella Croft. He detailed the dangerously high levels of the synthetic compound he had found in a 5-year-old's blood. Albright's lead lawyer shot to his feet, objecting furiously. "This is inadmissible, an unverified document from a defunct lab." Ada Cardenas simply smiled. "It's been verified, counsel. We ran a new sample of the medication seized from the Croft residence. It's a perfect match." Dr. Albright's composure cracked. A sheen of sweat appeared on his brow. He began to fidget with his tie. The foundation of his story was crumbling. "Now," Cardenas continued, her voice hardening, "let's talk about the tragic death of Isabella Croft." She gestured to the bailiff again. The door opened, and this time the mechanic, Rico, was escorted in. He avoided looking at Albright, his eyes fixed on the floor. At the sight of him, all the color drained from Dr. Albright's face. He knew in that instant that he was finished. Rico's confession was devastating. He recounted the meeting at the gala, the cash payment, the specific instructions on how to sabotage the brakes. He identified Dr. Albright in the room as the man who had paid him to kill Isabella Croft. Albright's lawyers were shouting, but their words were lost in the cold, hard finality of the mechanic's testimony. Dr. Albright made a strangled sound, a mix of a gasp and a sob. He slumped in his chair, his arrogant facade completely shattered, revealing the pathetic, terrified man beneath. He looked at Alistair, his eyes pleading, but found only a gaze as cold and unforgiving as a winter sea. The fight was over. The vindication was absolute. Within the hour, news of Dr. Albright's arrest for the murder of Isabella Croft as well as a litany of charges including fraud, reckless endangerment, and medical malpractice, was the leading story on every news channel. The media narrative didn't just flip, it imploded. The story of the scheming housekeeper and the unstable billionaire was replaced by the horrific truth of a monstrous doctor and the two people who had fought to expose him. The emergency court order was rescinded that same afternoon. Alistair, his face grim but his eyes alight with triumph, called Alara. "It's over," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Come home." Alara didn't even pack. She left the hotel and was driven straight to the mansion, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Alistair met her at the door. For a moment they just stood there, the titan of industry and the quiet housekeeper, their journey having forged a bond between them deeper than words. He simply nodded toward the stairs. "She's in her room." Alara ran up the grand staircase, her footsteps echoing in the suddenly hopeful silence. She found Lily in her bed, looking smaller and paler than ever. A state-appointed nurse sat in a chair in the corner, looking up with surprise. Alara ignored her. She walked to Lily's bedside and knelt down. Lily's eyes were closed, her face turned away. She looked as she had when Alara first arrived, a porcelain doll locked away from the world. Alara's heart ached. She reached out, her hand hovering over Lily's small shoulder, and began to hum. She poured all her hope, all her sorrow, and all her love into the simple, forgotten lullaby. At first there was no response. The nurse began to stand, to say something, but Alistair, who had appeared silently in the doorway, held up a hand to stop her. Alara continued to hum, her voice unwavering. Then, slowly, as if being pulled from a great depth, Lily stirred. Her small body turned. Her eyelids fluttered open. Her eyes, clouded with medication and despair, found Alara's face. A single perfect tear escaped the corner of her eye and traced a path down her pale cheek. She lifted a weak hand, and her tiny fingers closed around Alara's thumb, a grip of surprising strength. The connection was restored. The healing could begin again, this time for good. 1 year later, the conservatory was no longer a sterile glass box. It was a riot of life and color. Sunlight streamed through the clean panes, illuminating walls that were now covered in vibrant, cheerful drawings. Pictures of smiling suns, lopsided houses, and a recurring motif of a yellow duck filled every available space. In the center of the room, on the soft green rug, Lily Croft, now a bright-eyed 7-year-old, was carefully showing Alara the proper way to pot a geranium. "You have to make the hole deep," she instructed, her voice clear and confident, "so its feet are cozy." Alara smiled, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. "You're right. Cozy feet are very important for flowers." Alistair stood in the doorway watching them. The transformation in him was as profound as the one in his daughter. The permanent tension in his shoulders was gone, replaced by a relaxed posture. The grief that had carved harsh lines into his face had softened, leaving behind a quiet wisdom and a gentle warmth in his eyes. He was no longer the warden of a mausoleum. He was a father in his home. He watched as Lily patted the soil around the new plant, then looked up at Alara for approval. Alara beamed, tucking a stray strand of hair behind Lily's ear. In that simple maternal gesture, the truth of their new reality was laid bare. Alara was not a housekeeper. She was not an employee. She was Lily's mother in every way that mattered, and she was Alistair's partner, the co-architect of their rebuilt lives. Later that evening, after Lily was asleep, Alistair found Alara standing in the main living room, looking at the collection of photographs on the grand mantelpiece. He had rearranged them. In the center, in a large silver frame, was a new photo taken just last week in the garden. It showed the three of them, Alistair with his arm around Alara's shoulder, and Lily nestled between them, grinning a wide, toothy smile. Next to it, however, was a much smaller, older photograph that Alara had placed there herself. It was of a little girl with laughing eyes and a familiar, gentle smile. Ilara's eyes, Ilara's smile. It was her daughter, Ava, who she had lost to a sudden illness years ago. Alistair came to stand beside her, his presence a quiet comfort. He gently took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. He knew her story, just as she knew his. Their shared histories of loss were not scars to be hidden, but the foundations upon which they had built this new, unexpected family. "She would be so proud of you, Ilara," he said softly. Ilara leaned her head on his shoulder, the tears that came to her eyes, not of sorrow, but of a deep, cathartic peace. At that moment a small figure appeared in the doorway, clutching a worn wooden horse. It was Lily, her totem no longer a shield against the world, but a cherished toy. She padded over and wrapped her arms around both of their legs, completing their small circle. "I had a dream about a yellow duck," she announced sleepily. Their lives had found a new purpose. Dr. Chi Albright was serving consecutive life sentences, his name now a synonym for medical evil. In his place, Alistair and Ilara had established a major nonprofit, the Isabella and Ava Foundation, dedicated to providing legal and financial aid to families victimized by medical malpractice. Tonight was their inaugural fundraising gala. Alistair stood at the podium looking out at a sea of influential faces, but he wasn't speaking to them. He was speaking to the woman sitting at the front table next to a beaming Lily who was wearing a dress the color of sunshine. "Wealth and power cannot heal a broken heart," Alistair said, his voice steady and clear. "They cannot buy trust, and they cannot create love. I learned that the hard way. Everything I had, everything I was saved not by my fortune, but by the quiet courage of one woman who knew how to listen to silence and who taught a father how to hear his own daughter's heart for the first time." He raised his glass. "To Ilara?" The room erupted in applause, a wave of validation and celebration. But Ilara only had eyes for her family. She looked at Alistair on the stage and at the little girl beside her, who reached out to squeeze her hand. She had come to this house seeking a job, a way to survive her own grief. She had found a home instead, discovering that the most profound healing comes not from forgetting what you have lost, but from having the courage to build something new upon the sacred ground of memory. And it just goes to show that true family is not always the one you are born into, but the one you find when you are brave enough to open your heart after it has been broken. Before we go, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that.